The Calvin and Hobbes example, you said like that was good, it was a joke, but you also said that like in a novel, if you like piling on too many of those, it gets to be too over the top. So like, what are the principles of not making it go over the top in a novel?
I'm going to backpedal a little bit because the principle for novel is actually the same principle for Calvin and Hobbes. If the very first Calvin and Hobbes strip you'd read was a Sunday strip with the tiger and the boy hurtling down the hill, it wouldn't fire for you as well. It wouldn't trip all of those cylinders. You don't know that the tiger's really a stuffed animal and that Calvin has an amazing imagination. You don't know anything about these characters. You're just reading their observation about the world. In a novel, I'm going to use a different example. How many of you have ever watched a James Bond film? Shame on you. What happens in the first 10 minutes of a James Bond film? James Bond is awesome. Okay, now let's suppose for a moment that you are writing a novel about, awesome McHenry Awesome, and you want to do the James Bond style intro, where he is so over the top awesome in your first 10 pages that the reader is just instantly in love with him. How likely are you to succeed? Well, it depends on how good a writer you are, but let me tell you the hurdle you have to clear. You haven't yet earned that level of awesome with that character. When I go to a James Bond movie, they play James Bond music. I see 007 on the screen. It's Daniel Craig. Okay, who's older, Howard Taylor or Daniel Craig? Daniel Craig. Wait a minute. That sucks for me. Okay. You see Daniel Craig or Pierce Brosnan or Sean Connery. Sean Connery is also definitely older than me. And you know that this character is going to be awesome in the first 15 pages. They don't have to, or the first 5 minutes. The screenwriter doesn't have to earn it. It's a freebie. He's capitalizing on the rest of the franchise. If you want to tell a joke, or if you want to write a triumphant stand-up and cheer victory scene, and you haven't earned every single thing you're trying to pay off on, it'll fall flat. And so in Calvin and Hobbes, it succeeds because Bill Watterson spent a long time earning Calvin's character and Hobbes's character and the wagon's character and the hill's character. He established these things for us already. If you want to pull that sort of thing in your book, you have to do the same thing, which means that joke won't fly in Act 1. You're going to fulfill promises to your reader with that joke. You're familiar with Chekhov's gun? Yeah. Show of hands. Chekhov's gun, yes, no? No? Chekhov's gun? Then I need to explain it. Chekhov's gun, Chekhov's law says if there's a gun hanging on the wall in Act 1, it must be fired in Act 3. Corollary, if you want to fire a gun in Act 3, you need to hang it on the wall in Act 1. The operating principle is, when you put things in your book, you may be making promises to the reader. If you write something that feels to you like the fulfillment of a promise, but you haven't actually made the promise in Act 1 or Chapter 10 or whatever, then we will look at that and we will say, oh, that doesn't make any sense. That falls flat for me. So Scott, coming back around to your question, if you want to write something that pays off in 7 different ways, you can do it, but you are going to have to set up 7 different promises to the reader throughout that book and then pay them all off at once. If you guys have read, how many of you read Brandon Sanderson's stuff? You're in his class. Okay, when he writes conclusions to books, he rewrites and rewrites and rewrites and retroactively foreshadows and fixes things so that when you, the reader, for the first time, reach that ending, Brandon's rewritten it a dozen times to make sure that every promise made to the reader is getting fulfilled here in this scene, and that scene is not pulling anything that wasn't foreshadowed someplace else. The other principle, short name for this principle, is surprising yet inevitable. Inevitable is hard to pull off. Surprising is easy. It's a surprise, you just do something that they weren't expecting. be non sequitur. It doesn't follow. But that's not the same as surprising yet inevitable. Yes?
As a webcomic artist, you have to publish piecemeal and at a very brisk schedule, so you don't have the opportunity to do that sort of retroactive foreshadowing. When you work on a creative work, how do you set things up so that you can have things happen later on down the road when you haven't gotten there yet?
Prior to the advent of extreme high-speed photography and some higher dimensional sorts of mathematics that allowed us to look at how turbulence worked, we would look at the bumblebee and we would say, aerodynamically, it's impossible for the bumblebee to fly. How does the bumblebee do it? He just flaps really hard and thinks about where he wants to go. Did that answer your question? Because that's how I feel. No, seriously, that is exactly how I feel about it a lot of the time. I look at what I'm doing and I'm thinking, wow, I have no idea how this story is going to end. This thing that I just did, I know this thing is right. I do not know how it affects the end of the story. I'm just going to keep flapping. And it's a testament to my extreme good fortune. You thought I was going to say extreme good looks. I know. All right, I need to find a new comic drop victim. Testament to my extreme good fortune that it's mostly worked. I can look back at all of my stories and I can find places where I made promises to the reader that weren't fulfilled, or where I did things that I didn't feel were adequately foreshadowed. I've gotten better at not having those things happen. The important part of my process, the big ground-shaking part of my process is that once I hit the end of Act 2, I take everything that I've written, everything that's going to air on the web, and I sit down with my writers group and I say, go through this stuff and identify the promises you feel I've made to you. Don't tell me how you expect me to fulfill the promise unless you really want to help me write the ending, which is okay because I trust these guys. But tell me what promises I've made to you. And they will call out things, and I'll realize, oh my gosh, wow, that totally is a running gag. I need to take that, and I need to work that into the ending. And I can't think of great examples of that right now, but that Act 2 writers group session, I generate a clipboard full of character names and the promises made to the reader, the things that need to happen, that those characters need to do, or the events that need to happen in order to fulfill those promises. And then I set about writing it and often screw half of it up. And sometimes I think of something better. Orson Scott Card's principle for writing endings is, discard the first 5 endings you write, and then you've probably got something that the reader won't guess at. I don't know how many endings I go through before I find something that the reader hasn't guessed at. But the principle holds true. As I am writing the weekly installments, the daily installments, I always have an eye towards the ending, thinking, what does this imply? What promises am I making? It's great fun. It's great fun. It's exhilarating writing because the things that I write and the things that I illustrate appear online, typically within a month of me creating them. I try not to do the thing that everybody would expect me to do, which is to read the comments on the forums and figure out what they think the promises are, because most of those people are reading TV tropes and they're just off in the weeds, and I don't want to write what they're trying to write. So, Scott, you had another question.
So like this comedic foreshadowing, like I'm pretty murky on like what that actually looks like because I've never looked for plot foreshadowing. Like I feel like I kind of understand. Like I could recognize.
How much comedy have you read? Have you read Terry Pratchett?
No.
Okay. Then you have homework to do. Read Terry Pratchett. No, and this applies to all of you. This applies to all of you. Read something by Terry Pratchett. You don't have to do it this year or this week. Don't look at me like I just gave you homework. I did, but it's not due. I'm not going to grade it. Read Terry Pratchett, and when you laugh, ask yourself why. And ask yourself what pieces had to be there in order for you to laugh. How many of you have watched Community? Show of hands for, okay, so there's a reasonable number of you who've seen Community, and I'm trying to think of a moment in Community that's just a great payoff where things had to be set in motion. And there are so many, and I'm lost. The paintball episodes are hilarious. I love the paintball episode. And there's the moment where Abed sticks out his hand and says, "Come with me if you don't want to get paint on your clothes," which is, a stolen movie line. Come with me if you want to live. And why did I find that funny? Because I've seen the movie. I can't remember the movie, but I recognize it as a callback, and it was hilarious. My favorite moment from Community is where Abed is talking about the romantic relationship between Jeff and Britta. In season 1, I think it's like episode 4 or episode 5, where Jeff and Britta come in arguing, and they say, "Oh yeah, lovers spat. We're not lovers." And Abed explains, and they weren't lovers yet. They are by the end of the season, sort of. Abed explains the principle of dramatic romantic tension through the course of a TV series in about a minute and a half. And he says, so, Jeff and Britta are like so-and-so and so-and-so from Honeymooners, or Honeymooning. Which was the one with Bruce Willis and what's her name? Moonlighting. Thank you. Sorry, I'm absolutely illiterate. So he starts by saying, yeah, it's like these two, except if they're them, then you would be this, and you're not like this, but you're like this, and so maybe it's like Cheers. And he goes through and starts, and you know how Abed is, just rattling fast, and he relates everything to TV. At the end of that, he arrives at a conclusion where he says, and that is why, and I mean this on multiple possible levels, we can never be friends. Talking about the TV show Friends, and also talking about the fact that everybody at this table doesn't like each other, okay? And that, in terms of setup, we had to have set up the relationships for these characters for Abed to go off on that tirade, and we have to depend on people who are smarter than Howard to know what all of these TV shows are so that all of this unfolding can happen. Because Abed, every time he says something like that, he's grabbing something from the vernacular. When I say Friends, meaning the TV show, how many of you ever saw Friends? Okay, it's not really your generation's show, but what is your generation's show? What do you people watch?
Glee is supposedly.
How I Met Your Mother. Okay, so if I say, How I Met Your Mother, suddenly you have a whole raft of images. You've got a bunch of stuff in your head related to that. That is information that I can now use. When we talked about Utah's air quality, that's something you all have personal experience with. That's something that you draw upon. It's hard to depend on if you're writing a novel, but it's something that you can work with.
Well, but, the question is how do you create that for yourself? Not drawing for what's out there already, but I'm creating.
Your characters talk to each other and do stuff and advance the story and all of those things. They have lives that you describe, and that is what you're setting up. I don't want to make it sound like it's completely basic and inane a question, but this is what you as an author are doing, and as you are building these characters, you are going to use that information in other ways. Kate, I'm sorry, your hand, I have been looking over the top of your head for the whole, what's your question?
Okay. I just was going to say Arrested Development is a really good example of comedic foreshadowing. And all of their humor, a lot of their humor relies on just referencing back to the characters, which is what you're going to do in a novel. So if you're setting up your characters to be a certain way, you're referencing back to them.
That's it. Well, and the example I gave earlier about food storage versus wine cellar. Okay, if you have a character, well, let's say you got two characters in your book. One of them is a bookworm, loves books. And another one is an alcoholic, and they come across some sort of domicile, and there is a shelf. They're like, oh, wow, this shelf is awesome. This makes me want to put books in it. Well, this shelf makes me, want to buy beer. Makes me want to collect wine. I don't know. But as you play off between those two characters, they will say things like that. You'll realize they would see things differently. I don't know if Brandon's had that lecture with you yet, but you define your characters by what they see, how they perceive the world. Two different point of views, two different POV characters are going to be completely different, even looking at the same scene. And you're going to play off of that when you write humor, because one of them is going to see a bookshelf, and the other one is going to see a rack for video games, and another one is going to see a place to keep the dead body parts. I don't know. They're your characters. I didn't do that. I didn't put that in your book. That's all on you. Kevin.
I was thinking another good example of that would be Whedon's Firefly. Just
Yes.
These different casts seeing different things.
He does character-based humor really, really well. He does dialogue very strongly. The Avengers movie is a great example of setting up promises to the readers and fulfilling them later in the film, even if he did miss on a couple of big points that still have me a little bitter. Great moments that we wanted to see but didn't. Moment number one is when Thor, you remember when Thor pounded on Cap's shield and blew everybody down? When the two of them are being pounded on and Cap is low and they're being swarmed and Thor just sort of takes care of it? What Cap should have done is said, "Thor, hit me." That would have been a fulfillment of the promise, and we would have looked at that and said, "Holy crap, that's awesome. I totally didn't see that coming until you did it right then." Why did they not hire me to write that movie? Because Joss Whedon's way better at this than I am, and if he missed a couple of beats, I'll let it slide.